The US is a nation founded on freedom and equality. We broke away from the British so we could have freedom. Problem was, a lot of the country wasn't free, so we fought a civil war and gave everyone freedom. Then America proceeded to do the right thing again and fight the Nazis because they were against freedom. After we beat back the Krauts, Americans got real jazz for freedom and we finally made everyone equal. Then we stood up for freedom one final time and fought the communists because they hated freedom. Ever since then, we've been on an upward trajectory of freedom, equality, and prosperity. A shining example to the rest of the world. America has a checkered past, but we are always striving to live up to our ideals. Today, millions of people look to the US for the chance to lead a better life. If you're like me, this is the narrative about US history you were taught in school. You probably realize by now that this explanation is a little incomplete. Maybe you're aware of some of the monkey business the US has been involved in abroad. Maybe you've even heard whispers of torture, assassinations, and mind control experiments carried out by the US government. Every once in a while you hear about these things. You get a glimpse behind the narrative curtain. But this topic is often so nebulous and shrouded in conspiracy that it can be hard to get a cohesive picture of what the US is up to behind the scenes. So I took it upon myself to extensively research and study US involvement around the globe and collate it into the definitive US interventions tier list. And by research, I mean reading Wikipedia pages, but you can probably already tell I'm not exactly a scholar. I have my microphone taped to my desk, for God's sake. Hey, it's YouTube. If you want to get smart, go read a book. And I will actually have some of those at the end, if you're curious. As you can probably imagine, this list is fairly extensive. So for this video, I've compiled the hits. From the most successful to the biggest blunders, from the most outrageous to the most obscure, from the funniest to the most blood-curdlingly brutal. We got them all. But remember, this isn't just a list, it's a tier list. I'll be ranking each operation based on how successful it was from an American perspective, of course, because America is the good guy. That's the lesson of this video. Everything is time-stamped, so feel free to skip around. One last thing before we get started. I feel compelled to state this is not a full retelling of history. As I alluded to in the beginning, there are events and details that I have left out of this video entirely. This video is a historiography. I have collected history into a narrative. I think it's interesting that in many Romance languages, the root of history is story. So today, let me tell you a story about an empire not so long ago. Our tale begins in the late 19th century, in a series of conflicts known as the Banana Wars. While this title may sound like a Mario Party minigame, it's a very serious and very deadly set of conflicts that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century, as America was just starting to stretch its wings as an imperial power. Since the inception of the Monroe Doctrine, the US has seen the Western Hemisphere as our domain. As European colonialism started to wane in Latin America in the late 19th century, the US took a more active role in securing its economic interests in the region, which included taking control of the Panama Canal Zone and also making sure that extractive US agriculture companies could absolutely move weight without pesky things like democratic oversight or labor laws. This meant direct intervention in Panama, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Mexico, Haiti, Honduras, and Cuba, where to this day, the United States maintains a presence in Guantanamo Bay. Much of this intervention was done directly by US Marines. I would argue that these campaigns were sort of the training wheels on the imperial machine that the US would seek to impose on Latin America and indeed the rest of the world later in the 20th century. In fact, we will be revisiting many of these countries as the Cold War heats up. Spoiler alert. Sending in troops is a crude and costly method of domination that would later be made obsolete by the much more sophisticated, opaque apparatus of subversion and espionage that we will see emerge as time goes on. Taken as a whole though, the Banana Wars were a total success. They gave the US a little taste of the empire business while also allowing it to protect its commercial interests in the region. We did have to commit troops to it, which, like I said, can get kind of messy, but it's the 20th century. Imperialism is basically equivalent to farting. It's a little gross, but everyone does it. In an environment where powerful countries grinding up smaller ones into paste has virtually zero PR consequences, why not do it? The Banana Wars are A tier. Russia, 1918. This one is basically the genesis point
for everything else to come. It's extremely important and hardly anyone knows about it. In 1917, the Russian monarchy is overthrown by a democratic capitalist interim government. However, tensions continue to rise, and in October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, take power. Not everybody accepts Soviet rule, and the country descends into civil war. There were several parties involved, but the two main factions were the socialist Reds, who had just taken power, and the recently overthrown Whites, a disparate group of monarchists, social democrats, and capitalists. Fast forward to March of 1918, and Russia exits World War I. The Allies feel betrayed that their war buddy ducked out on them, and many of the Allied governments fear a red wave sweeping them out of office. Not to mention, France and Britain in particular are keen to protect the investments they've made in Tsarist Russia. Anyway, the French and the British are short on troops, so they're like, "Hey, Woody, would you lend us some of your boys to squash these communists?" And Woodrow Wilson is like, "For sure, dude, here's 13,000. I'm assuming that's how Woodrow Wilson talked. It's important to note that the US was far from the only country to commit troops to this conflict. Even though this is a US foreign interventions tier list, this one was a bit of a group project. Ultimately, though, it wasn't enough. In fact, I'm somewhat persuaded by the argument that US and Allied entry into the conflict actually served to aid the Bolsheviks by allowing them to credibly paint themselves as patriots, resisting a foreign coup attempt, which they kind of were. This event really set the tone of mutual hostility between the Soviet Union and the Allies. Bolshevik leadership was convinced, perhaps correctly, that the West would take any opportunity they could to overthrow them. As for the US, this was a big loss. They failed to strangle socialism in its crib. Allowing the Soviet Union to survive would have massive ripple effects, with the struggle between capitalism and communism coming to define much of the 20th century. As the tide of anti-colonialism and communism continued to rise, often with the help of the Soviet Union, the US would have to grapple with this failure. Russia is F tier. Before I go any further, I would like to add a special note. I think these two interventions, the Bolshevik Revolution and the Banana Wars, ought to be given special emphasis. I would argue that these two campaigns are sort of the prologue to everything else I'm about to talk about. The Russian Civil War provided the why, and the Banana Wars provided the how. Fast forward to 1945. Korea. World War II is coming to a close, with the Japanese surrendering in August. Korean independence activists move immediately to establish the People's Republic of Korea. But in September 1945, US forces arrive and establish the United States Army military government in Korea. Really rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? In May 1948, Syngman Rhee wins the South Korean presidential election. Although calling it an election is a bit of a stretch, considering it was limited to property owners, taxpayers, and village elders. Rhee rules as a dictator until 1961, when he is overthrown by a similarly authoritarian regime that would persist until the mid-1980s. Overall, Korea was pretty messy. It entailed a full-on war in the 50s, and as a leader, Rhee was far from a teddy bear. But hey, when it comes to containing socialism, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. Up to and including jailing 30,000 suspected dissidents and massacring civilians. Korea is B tier. China, 1945. This one honestly makes no sense to me. I'm not sure why the US thought this would work. Maybe some of you strategic geniuses out there will be able to correct me, but this just seems like a blunder. During World War II, there was sort of a three-way within China. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, the communists, led by Mao Zedong, and of course the occupying Japanese. During the war, the US provided aid to the nationalists. After the Japanese surrender, the US continued to provide aid to the nationalists, including by transporting and deploying Imperial Japanese troops. Real great way to instantly give your enemy the moral high ground. When you have your guys pulling up to the battlefield with the people that were literally just occupying their country. President Truman put it this way: it was perfectly clear to us that if we told the Japanese to lay down their arms and immediately march to the seaboard, the entire country would be taken over by the communists. We therefore had to take the unusual step of using the enemy as a garrison. There it is, straight from the horse's mouth. Except the communists won anyway. Oops, China's D tier. Albania, 1949. This one is juicy. Absolute spy thriller material. Albania after World War II is ruled by the communists. At this point, the monarchist and nationalist factions have pretty much lost all their clout due to collaborating with fascist Italian and German occupiers. Nonetheless, the communists are in a weak spot. Their country's been trashed by fighting, and they're cut off from the rest of the Eastern Bloc by Yugoslavia, which split from the Soviet Union a year prior in 1948. Amidst this chaos, the US and Britain decide to begin their operation. They collaborate on a project to overthrow communist Albania, which the British call Operation Valuable and the US call Operation Fiend. In what I find a pretty hilarious contrast between our national characters. The plan, however, is nothing short of a James Bond movie. The plot calls for forces loyal to King Zog. Yes, that's his real name. These Zoggers, Zog boys, are to be dropped into the Mati region of Albania, where intelligence indicates the population is loyal to Zog. Once inside, these agents are to incite a popular uprising, which would be further supported by allied airdrops. The thought was that if the uprising was successful, it could spill over into an all-out civil war, which would set off a chain reaction of popular revolts all across the Eastern Bloc. However, this was quickly revealed to be wishful thinking. Anti-communist guerrillas are intermittently airdropped and delivered by boat to Albania between 1949 and 1952, with disastrous results. The paramilitary group fails to incite the Albanian people to revolution, forcing the fighters to fall back on a campaign of ineffectual sabotage. In one instance, operators found Albanian security forces waiting for them at a rendezvous point and were forced to transmit the all-clear signal. However, the radio operator had been schooled to deliver the message in such a way that it was revealed he was transmitting under duress. Remarkably, the Albanians were seemingly aware of this, and the operator was forced to transmit the signal faithfully, causing several paratroopers to land directly into an ambush. I told you this plot was juicy. In 1954, Operation Valuable is officially canned, with 300 operators either captured or killed. Abazar Menji, co-founder of Bali Combatir, an Albanian nationalist organization who provided the manpower for Operation Valuable, stated, "Our allies wanted to make use of Albania as a guinea pig," with another member stating, "We were used as an experiment. We were a small part of a big game. Pawns that could be sacrificed." Which, yeah, dude, you should have realized that when you signed up. It's the US and the UK, for crying out loud. You think they were just concerned world citizens committed to the cause of Albanian nationalism? Give me a break. Hi, yeah, spy chief of a global imperial power here. We're looking to subvert your country's government. We can be trusted, by the way, famous for not keeping secrets. Regardless, they are right. Albania was little more than a training exercise, an opportunity for CIA and MI6 agents to get their feet wet at the dawn of the Cold War. In fact, this operation might have languished in historical obscurity if it had not been declassified in 2006 as part of the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. Wait, what? That's right. That group I mentioned earlier, Bali Combatir, what do you think I meant when I said they were an Albanian nationalist group? Any guesses as to who they sided with during World War II? I'll give you a hint. Their name translates to National Front, and their motto is Albania for the Albanians, death to the traitors. To me, this little wrinkle adds so much flavor to what would otherwise be a stock standard Cold War operation. I guess in the eyes of the US, communism is so bad that nothing is off the table to combat it, up to and including using actual Axis soldiers and collaborators to fight against it. Looking at you, China. Overall, this conflict was pretty small stakes and therefore was a small failure. Albania is C tier. Guatemala, 1952. Remember the Banana Wars? This one's gonna give you deja vu. In 1944, Guatemala's pro-business authoritarian regime is swept out of power by a democratic revolution. This threatens the US-backed right-wing dictators in the region. In 1950, Jacobo Arbenz is elected president of Guatemala and introduces land reform and anti-exploitation laws. This threatens the interests of the United Fruit Company, who was the largest landholder in Guatemala and whose yearly revenue was twice that of the Guatemalan government. Arbenz also legalizes the Communist Guatemalan Party of Labor, which sets off alarm bells in the U.S. intelligence apparatus. After extensive lobbying from the United Fruit Company, the CIA begins Operation PB Fortune to overthrow the Guatemalan government. Although, let's be honest, you don't exactly need a silver tongue to convince the Langley boys to overthrow a regime. Before you can finish the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto, they're out the door with a rifle. Hey, better safe than sorry, right? Last thing you want is for peasants to own the land that they work on. Anyway, Operation Fortune gets underway, but thanks to Nicaraguan dictator Somoza's loose lips, the CIA's role in the plot becomes widely known among Central American government officials. Feeling that their cover has been blown, the CIA freezes Operation PB Fortune. But fear not, the plans were not scrapped. They were merely put on the back burner until the heat could cool off. Fast forward to 1954, and Truman has been replaced by Eisenhower, a much more hawkish Cold Warrior. The time is right. Operation PB Success is born. The CIA trains a force to invade Guatemala, led by Carlos Castillo Armas, a military officer exiled in Honduras. And goodness gracious, look at that stash. Anyway, the invasion commences in 1954 with some help from regional dictators. The invading force actually does pretty poorly initially, but is bolstered by several bombers supplied by the US, as well as a robust psychological warfare campaign. On May 1st, a radio station by the name of Voice of Liberation begins broadcasting anti-government propaganda, exaggerating the size and victories of the invading force. The station claims to be broadcasting from deep in the jungles of the Guatemalan hinterlands, but the broadcasts are actually being cooked up in Miami. Coincidentally, these propaganda efforts are bolstered by the fact that the government dish is down for maintenance at the time. The psychological warfare campaign, combined with the invaders' air support, leads to extreme demoralization among the Guatemalan military and populace. On June 27th, President Arbenz resigns. Castillo Armas becomes the first in a line of many military dictators to rule Guatemala, and rules back many of the progressive reforms made during the democratic period. Guatemala is open for business. 3 days after Arbenz's resignation, the CIA begins to destroy all files related to Operation PB Success. When the United States Senate Oversight Committee attempts to investigate the operation in 1975, the CIA states it had lost all such files. The CIA also lied to President Eisenhower while briefing him on the operation's casualties. The perceived efficiency of the operation made it the model for further Central American regime change. The US continued its military and diplomatic support for Guatemala's military regime, even as they engaged in a genocide against the native Mayan population, resulting in the death of over 40,000 people. In 1999, President Clinton officially apologized to the Guatemalan people for the atrocities committed by US-backed dictatorship. Which is good, I guess, but you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak. I said I was sorry, alright? Everybody does a little genocide now and then. Now watch this sax solo. Guatemala is A tier. Since 1944, Iran had been a constitutional monarchy, sort of like the UK. All this was well and good until reformist politician Mohammad Mossadegh moved to nationalize the oil industry. Using your country's natural resources to benefit the population rather than multinational corporations. Smells like communism. The CIA launches Operation Ajax to remove Mossadegh from power and install the monarch Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as dictator. Pahlavi's military government rules as a secular, pro-Western, anti-communist force until 1979, when the Iranian Revolution replaces him with an Islamic Republic, which basically means that women have to cover their faces in public and gays get the death penalty. Iran today is politically repressive, diplomatically isolated, and economically hamstrung.
And not even in a way that benefits us. Come on, guys. That's the whole point.
Iran is D tier. Indonesia, 1957. This is probably the crown jewel of coups, and I bet you've never even heard of it. Since 1945, Indonesia was ruled by Sukarno, a non-aligned nationalist and an anti-imperialist who helped Indonesia get independence from the Dutch. He's not a communist by any stretch, but his neutrality in the face of a thawing Cold War is enough to put him in Washington's crosshairs. In 1957, Eisenhower orders that Sukarno must be overthrown. A year later, in 58, the United States supports a rebellion of military officers in Indonesia. They also use their front organization, Civil Air Transport, to bomb a marketplace and several merchant vessels in an attempt to weaken the Indonesian economy. This move also kills many civilians. Ultimately, though, the rebellion is defeated in 1961, and the CIA plane is shot down and its pilot captured. Eisenhower scrambles to deny US involvement, and the CIA is forced to go back to the drawing board. Throughout the 50s and 60s, the Communist Party of Indonesia continues to grow, along with Sukarno's support for it. This worries large landholders, religious authorities, and of course, the US. As early as 1958, the CIA begins to seek out anti-communist elements in the Indonesian military and offer them assurances of military and financial support. The CIA also goes so far as to produce a porn video featuring a Soviet flight attendant and an actor playing Sukarno in an attempt to defame him and smear him as a communist. Tragically, it is never released. In 1965, a conflict breaks out between Indonesian military leaders. US-backed General Suharto, not to be confused with President Sukarno, uses this as an excuse to take power. Using a propaganda campaign, the military government incites the populace to attack suspected communists. Over the next several months, the military engages in a mass killing campaign against political opponents, leaving an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people dead. The US had no small part in these killings. In one chilling example, US diplomats provided the Indonesian army officials with a list of 5,000 Communist Party members and other leftists, and then checked off the names of those who had been murdered. With the left anti-imperialist movement lobotomized, Indonesia went from a strong advocate for Cold War neutrality to a compliant US lapdog virtually overnight. The Central Intelligence Agency's efforts were so successful, in fact, that it was used as a model for further repression campaigns. This playbook became known as the Jakarta method, and most people have no idea about this episode in US history at all. Indonesia is a masterclass. Its brutality is stunning, its cruelty is elegant, and its scale is breathtaking. It's like a symphony of evil, a spectacle so all-consuming you can't look away. A tier. Congo, 1960. In 1960, the Congo achieves full independence from Belgium, with Patrice Lumumba as its first democratically elected leader. Several months later, the Congo erupts into civil war. Lumumba asks the US and UN for help, but they refuse to intervene. Eventually, Lumumba asks the Soviet Union for help, which worries the US. The Congo has sizable uranium deposits, which is something you need to build nukes, if you didn't know. Anyway, the Eisenhower administration realizes they have to get this guy out. They initially plan to poison his toothpaste, but that scheme is abandoned. The US encourages Army Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko to overthrow Lumumba, which he does. The US begins to fund Mobutu, and he eventually wins the civil war in 1965. He promises democracy will return in 5 years and is initially popular, but begins to rule as a dictator. Overall, the Congo conflict is pretty sad. Lumumba wasn't even a communist. He just couldn't get help from the international community or the West and took the next best option. The US crushed the dream for a democratic Congo, and all to deny their opponent access to potential uranium reserves. That being said, it worked. Mobutu ruled as a staunch anti-communist, and the Congo was open for investment from exploitative Western corporations. What more can you really ask for? Congo is B tier. Cuba, 1961. In 1958, US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista is overthrown by Fidel Castro. Having a Marxist government in Latin America is bad enough, but 90 miles off the coast of Florida? That's within nuking range. The US military intelligence apparatus kicks into gear immediately to shut it down. In 61, a US-backed force of Cuban exiles invades the Bay of Pigs and is beaten back in 3 days. Major loss. Che Guevara sends a note to Kennedy which reads, "Thanks for Playa Guyan. Before the invasion, the revolution was weak. Now, it's stronger than ever." Kennedy is distraught about the invasion's failure, apparently telling an administration official he wanted to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Unfortunately, this did not happen. In fact, the Kennedy administration reportedly redoubled its efforts to overthrow the Castro regime. Under the designation Operation Mongoose, which is a pretty whimsical name for what was actually a campaign of US orchestrated terrorism against Cuba. CIA-aligned forces sabotaged a railway bridge, petroleum storage and refinery facilities, a molasses storage facility, a power plant, a sawmill, and a floating crane. There's also a second very significant aspect of Operation Mongoose that I think is worth talking about. Concurrent with their sabotage efforts, the CIA developed several plots to kill, harass, defame, or otherwise get at Fidel the Beard Castro, the first of which actually had to do with his beard. The plan was to sneak thallium salts into Fidel's shoes, causing his hair to fall out and ruining his reputation. Sadly, this half-baked plot fell through. Another idea was to infuse either Castro's cigars or the radio station where he frequently spoke with LSD, causing him to embarrass himself when he gave a speech. This didn't work either, or at least, if it did, it didn't have the intended effect.
It is entirely possible
that Fidel Castro had the world's first Joe Rogan experience. Castro also loved to dive, so the CIA devised a plot to take him out, either with a diving suit poisoned with fungus or with seashells rigged with explosives. Most famously, though, the CIA sought to capitalize on Castro's love of cigars by slipping an exploding cigar into Castro's supply. None of these plots worked. Today, Cuba remains under a strict embargo. The UN has passed a resolution condemning it every year for the past 30 years, but it doesn't look like the US position will be changing anytime soon. Although the US continues its policy of economic hostility, it's pretty hard to deny the facts. We lost. We failed at the Bay of Pigs, we failed to turn the Cuban people against Castro, and we failed to get Castro himself. Cuba today is not a perfect country by any means, but it's a pretty bad look that despite all we put them through, they still have a higher life expectancy than us. Besides, our blatant aggression will give the Cuban leadership a big, scary, and very real other to fight against until the end of time. Cuba is F tier. Operation Condor was a US-backed campaign of state repression, terror, torture, and mass disappearances that spanned over 2 decades, 5 administrations, and 10 countries. Nearly every South American country was the victim of a Condor operation, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths and hundreds of thousands of political prisoners. Victims included dissidents and leftists, union and peasant leaders, priests, monks and nuns, students and teachers, intellectuals, and suspected guerrillas. Though many of these actions were carried out by the militaries, dictatorships, and intelligence apparatuses of their respective countries, the United States government provided planning, coordination, training on torture, technical support, and military aid to the juntas. Not to mention, many of these military governments and authoritarian regimes were put in power with the help of the United States. In Brazil, democratic reformer João Goulart's government was intentionally destabilized by United States sanctions and aid to Goulart's opposition. Goulart was overthrown by the military, at which point the United States reinstated aid and investment. In Chile, democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende comes to power. President Nixon had promised to make the economy scream to prevent Allende from coming to power or to unseat him.
Well, Corey said that he had received instructions to do anything short of a Dominican-type, alleged to have said that.
Well, he was instructed to.
Well, but
I hoped it, but he just failed. That's his main problem. He should have kept Allende from getting in.
The CIA, through Project Fubelt, works to create the conditions for a coup, and in 1973, Allende is overthrown by military dictator Augusto Pinochet. In Bolivia, the United States government supported the 1971 coup led by Hugo Banzir that toppled socialist President Juan Torres. The US continued to provide extensive aid, military and otherwise, to the Banzir dictatorship. Torres was later kidnapped and assassinated in 1976 as part of a Condor operation. In Argentina, the US supported a brutal military coup that leaves over 30,000 people dead or disappeared. These are just a few examples. Once the military dictatorships were in power, they were free to go after civilians in any way they pleased. In Chile, suspected dissidents were subject to a wide manner of physical, psychological, and sexual torture. Victims were often strapped to metal beds and electrocuted, or forced to lay down and have their limbs run over by vehicles. And this is only what I feel comfortable saying on YouTube. In Uruguay, the United States backed and was intimately involved in Alfredo Stroessner's anti-communist military dictatorship, even going so far as to send US military personnel to help build a detention and interrogation center named La Technica. Inside La Technica, Stroessner's secret police bathed their captives in tubs of human vomit and shocked them with electric cattle prods. They even dismembered the Communist Party secretary alive with a chainsaw while Stroessner listened on the phone. Stroessner often demanded that the tapes of detainees screaming in pain be played to their relatives. I cannot stress this enough. The United States had full knowledge of what Operation Condor entailed. A September 1976 report from the Defense Intelligence Agency reported that U.S. intelligence services were aware that Operation Condor meant gathering intelligence on, as well as torturing and assassinating suspected dissidents. On October 5th, 1976, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger met with Argentina's foreign minister and said, "Look, our basic attitude is that we would like you to succeed. I have an old-fashioned view that friends ought to be supported. What is not understood in the United States is that you have a civil war. We read about human rights problems, but not the context. The quicker you succeed, the better. The human rights problem is a growing one." Presumably, when he speaks of the human rights problem, he is not referring to the violations being committed as the issue, but rather the public's growing awareness of them. There is so much more to Operation Condor that I chose not to cover, either for the sake of time or because the details are too grisly for YouTube. The military takeovers in Latin America and the subsequent repression and terror caused by them were brutally successful in suppressing popular socialist movements. If the will of the people were allowed to be enacted, things would have likely gone very differently in South America. Operation Condor is A tier. You may have noticed that Operation Condor was somewhat more diffuse than the single country incidents I have covered thus far. But before I get back to the regularly scheduled programming, I want to touch on one of these other sort of anthologies of repression. While Operation Condor represented a major thrust of the foreign front of America's Cold War, there is another side of this conflict that often goes overlooked. I'm speaking of an effort by America's top-level military and intelligence apparatuses. An effort to surveil citizens and neutralize dissidents. An effort to develop torture methods. An effort to influence politics in a manner that was highly secret and incredibly illegal. This is the home front. This is the domestic war. Throughout the 20th and 21st century, the CIA, the FBI, and the military have not shied away from using the American populace in whatever way they see fit to accomplish their aims. There's perhaps no better example of this than Mkultra. Mkultra was the name given to a secret and extremely illegal CIA program which attempted, in essence, to uncover a method of mind control, to manipulate subjects or force a confession. The CIA utilized a number of tactics for this, including electroshock, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and isolation, among others. Chief among these tools of torture, however, was LSD. The psychoactive drug was administered to military personnel, civilians, and even CIA members, usually without their knowledge or consent. Once Project Mkultra got underway in April 1953, experiments included administering LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and prostitutes. People who, as one CIA officer put it, could not fight back. In Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up several brothels within safe houses in San Francisco with the goal of experimenting on men who would be too embarrassed to talk about what had happened to them. The men were secretly dosed with LSD, and the brothels were equipped with one-way mirrors. Sessions were filmed for later viewing and study. These experiments were also carried out internationally. In areas under American control in the early 1950s in Europe and East Asia, mostly Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, the CIA created secret detention centers, capturing people suspected of being enemy agents and others deemed expendable. These prisoners were interrogated while being administered psychoactive drugs, electroshocked, and subject to extremes of temperature, sensory isolation, and the like, to develop a better understanding of how to destroy and control human minds. By 1963, the CIA had synthesized many of the findings from its psychological research into what became known as the Coup Counterintelligence Interrogation Handbook, which cited Mkultra studies and other secret research programs as a scientific basis for their interrogation methods. Latin American paramilitary groups working for the CIA and US military received training in these psychological techniques at places such as the School of the Americas. In the 21st century, many of the torture techniques developed in the Mkultra studies and other programs have been used at US military and CIA prisons such as Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. In 1973, amid a government-wide panic caused by Watergate, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all Mkultra files destroyed. Only about 20,000 documents incorrectly stored in the financial records building survived the purge. Because most of its documentation was destroyed, a full accounting of Mkultra is impossible. But I think you'll agree that what we do know is fairly damning. Due to its sci-fi premise and top-level secrecy, MKUltra remains shrouded in conspiracy. But make no mistake, MKUltra was a very real and very inhumane set of experiments carried out by the US government. However, this is far from the only unethical action the US engaged in order to gain an upper hand in the Cold War. The US has not shied away from collecting data on its own people. Among these were Project Shamrock and Project Minaret, in which the NSA, upon request by the FBI and CIA, intercepted all American citizens' incoming and outgoing telegraphic communication. Another program, HT Lingual, intercepted and recorded all physical US mail destined for the Soviet Union or China. And while you may be tempted to think that this campaign of surveillance is a Cold War artifact, it has very much continued into the 21st century. Following 9/11, the Patriot Act was signed into law, massively expanding state power to search and surveil citizens, often without probable cause. Through documents revealed by Edward Snowden, we now know that the NSA was harvesting millions of email and text contact lists, searching email content, tracking and mapping the location of cell phones, and undermining attempts at encryption. The NSA was also shown to be secretly accessing Yahoo and Google data centers to collect information from hundreds of millions of account holders worldwide by tapping undersea cables. However, US activities have gone further than passive surveillance. A substantive part of this domestic war involved actively disrupting, harassing, and assassinating US citizens and groups deemed subversive, including feminist organizations, the Communist Party of the United States of America, anti-war organizers, civil rights activists, environmental and animal rights organizations, and the American Indian movement. The intended effect of COINTELPRO was to neutralize subversive groups by instructing field operatives to 1. Create negative public image for targeted groups, for example through surveilling activists and then releasing negative personal information to the public. 2. Breaking down internal organization by creating conflicts, for example by having agents exacerbate racial tensions or sending anonymous letters to try and create conflicts. 3. Create dissension between groups, for example by spreading rumors that particular groups were stealing money. 4. Restrict access to public resources, for example by pressuring non-profit organizations to cut off funding or material support. 5. Restrict the ability to organize protests, for example through agents promoting violence against police during planning and at the protests. And 6. Restrict the ability of individuals to participate in group activities, for example by character assassinations, false arrests, or surveillance. One of the FBI's primary targets was Martin Luther King. After MLK's 1963 March on Washington, William C. Sullivan, the agent in charge of wiretaps under Hoover, wrote of King, "In the light of King's powerful demagogic speech, we must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security." Attorney General Robert Kennedy approved the wiretapping of King's phone, and the FBI began to systemically bug King's home and hotel rooms. The FBI even sent a letter to MLK, anonymously urging him to kill himself, accompanied by a tape documenting a series of King's sexual improprieties obtained through various bugs and wiretaps over the course of 2 years. An excerpt from the letter. "There's only one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bare to the nation." However, the FBI did not stop at surveillance and infiltration. According to the ACLU, the FBI funded, armed, and controlled the anti-communist paramilitary Secret Army Organization, who harassed anti-war protesters by firebombing cars, burglarizing homes, and ransacking places of work. Not only did the FBI sponsor mayhem and intimidation, they did not flinch at murder. Determined to break up the Black Panthers and other black radical groups, the FBI orchestrated an armed raid with the Chicago police on Black Panther leader Fred Hampton's apartment. They had obtained detailed information about the residence, including the layout of furniture, from William O'Neill, Black Panther and FBI informant. A 14-man team was organized for a pre-dawn raid, armed with a search warrant for illegal weapons. On the evening of December 3rd, O'Neill slips a sedative into Hampton's drink. At 1:30 a.m., Hampton falls asleep mid-sentence while on the phone with his mother. At 4:45 a.m., a heavily armed police team storms the apartment. One of Hampton's fellow Panthers is on security, sitting in the front room with a shotgun in his lap. The police shoot him in the chest, killing him instantly. As he dies, his body convulses, firing a round into the ceiling of the apartment. This is the only shot fired by a Panther during the raid. Police officers stormed Hampton's bedroom and removed his girlfriend, 9 months pregnant with their child. The officers then fire into the bedroom, wounding Hampton in the shoulder. Black Panther Harold Bell said he heard the following exchange. "That's Fred Hampton. Is he dead? Bring him out. He's barely alive. He'll make it. Fred Hampton was then shot twice in the head. His body was dragged to the doorway of the bedroom and left in a pool of blood. The officers directed their fire at the remaining Panthers, grievously wounding 4. The men were then beaten and arrested. Concurrent with the U.S. intelligence state efforts to crack down on anti-war protesters and civil rights activists was a series of legislative actions which, in theory, served the same goal of stamping out subversive elements of American society: the war on drugs. The policy was designed for, in the words of Richard Nixon, the prevention of new addicts and the rehabilitation of those already addicted, by cracking down on the distribution, production, and consumption of illegal drugs. However, the policy was far from fair. In 1986, Congress passed laws creating a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for trafficking or possession of crack cocaine when compared to penalties for trafficking of powdered cocaine. This is, in my opinion, a blatantly discriminatory policy against blacks, who were far more likely to use crack than powdered cocaine. People convicted of possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine would have to be found guilty of possession of 500 grams of powdered cocaine to receive the same sentence. And these disparities bore out in the statistics. According to Human Rights Watch, crime statistics show that in the United States in 1999, compared to non-minorities, African Americans were far more likely to be arrested for drug crimes and receive much stiffer penalties and sentences. The Nixon White House was, of course, aware of what their policy really meant. John Eldridgeman, Nixon's assistant for domestic affairs, was quoted as saying, "You gotta know what this war on drugs was really all about." The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. At the same time as the US government was cracking down on drug use publicly, elements of it were secretly involved with drug trafficking. Throughout the 80s, the US gave support to a group of Nicaraguan rebels known as the Contras. As well as being a military force, the Contras were also known to traffic drugs. A 1988 Senate report found that members of the US State Department who provided support for the Contras are involved in drug trafficking, and elements of the Contras themselves knowingly receive financial and material assistance from drug traffickers. The report further states that the US State Department continued to provide support to drug traffickers associated with the Contras, even after the traffickers had been indicted on drug charges, or while those traffickers were under active investigation by those same agencies. Remember the Contras. They'll be important later. In 1996, journalist Gary Webb published reports in the San Jose Mercury News, and later in his book Dark Alliance, claiming that for the better part of a decade, a San Francisco Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to the Crips and Blood street gangs of Los Angeles, and funneled millions in drug profits to a Latin American guerrilla army run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. This drug ring opened the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels and the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles, and as a result, the cocaine that flooded in helped spark a crack explosion in urban America. A huge influx of drugs, aided by CIA and State Department funding, along with massive sentencing disparities, combined with devastating effects on urban communities and paved the way for mass incarceration. Today, the U.S. has the highest prison population in the world overall and per capita.
I just got one thing to lay on you cats and then I'll split. That I'm declaring war on anybody who sells drugs in our community.
But Black Dynamite, I sell drugs to the community.
The events which I have just relayed to you, in my mind, constitute a sort of shadow civil war, with activists, reformers, and radicals on one side, and the military intelligence apparatus of the state on the other. This campaign displays a total disregard for the rights, privacy, and dignity of the American people. That being said, it did succeed in culling some of the more radical elements of American activism, as well as quelling potentially restive segments of the population. Due to the highly sensitive and illegal nature of these activities, as well as the noted destruction of documents, I'd be willing to bet there's probably a lot more to this story we will never know about. B tier. Afghanistan, 1979. In 1978, the Sour Revolution brings a one-party Soviet-backed state to power in Afghanistan. The U.S. begins Operation Cyclone to provide weapons and funding for a collection of warlords and jihadi guerrillas known as the Mujahideen. The first CIA-supplied weapons were dusty British Lee-Enfield rifles shipped out in December 1979, but by September 1976, the program included state-of-the-art weaponry, such as 2,300 Stinger missiles. Some of the CIA's greatest Afghan beneficiaries were Islamist commanders that were key allies of, you guessed it, Osama bin Laden. In fact, many of these CIA-funded militias would later become part of Al-Qaeda, including bin Laden himself. By 1992, the combined US, Saudi, and Chinese aid to the Mujahideen was valued at $6 to $12 billion, whereas Soviet military aid in Afghanistan was valued at $36 to $48 billion. The result was a heavily armed, militarized Afghan society, making Afghanistan a hotspot for gun runners and Islamist militants. Hint, hint. I mean, like, we flood a country with weapons without really caring where they go, and they end up in the hands of a bunch of religious nutcases. What a surprise. Actually, it's not a surprise. We knew that would happen. We encouraged it. Oh, what? Those same nutcases now don't like us because A, they're nutcases, and B, we did a type of imperialism that they don't like? And now those nutcases are going to turn around and attack us? Oh, surprise, surprise. Now Afghanistan's a hotspot for terrorism. Wonder how that happened. Guess we gotta invade. Oh wait, they're fighting back with the weapons we gave them. And then we realize, oops, literally rebuilding an entire country from the ground up isn't something you can do by just importing fast food chains, and we leave after 20 years getting nothing done, and now the Taliban is flying around in helicopters and shooting off mortars that we left for our puppet government. What kind of military genius could have seen this coming? Ultimately, we got nothing from Afghanistan except consequences. I guess we did beat the Soviets away from a desert. Like, nice job, guys. Afghanistan is D tier. In 1979, the Sandinistas, the socialist revolutionary group, overthrew the Somoza family, which the US had put in power and continued to support. On November 17, 1981, Reagan signed National Security Directive 17, allowing covert support to anti-Sandinista forces known as the Contras. The US secretly arms, trains, and funds these Contras to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. As part of the training, the CIA distributes a manual entitled Psychological Operations in Guerrilla War, which instructs the Contras, among other things, on how to blow up public buildings, assassinate judges, and blackmail ordinary civilians. In addition to providing military support for rebels, the CIA directly mined Nicaraguan harbors from January to March 1984. Of course, Nicaragua takes the US to international court, and the court rules in favor of Nicaragua, determining that the United States was in breach of its obligations under customary international law not to use force against another state. The court ordered the United States to pay reparations to Nicaragua for violating international law, but we didn't pay it, obviously. International court means nothing when you're a deadbeat. I mean, it also helps if you got more nukes than stars in the sky, but you know. Anyway, the public pressure gets to be where the government can't help but act. The US legislature passes the Boland Amendment, which is designed to make it illegal for the United States to fund Contra activities. However, Reagan is hell-bent on overthrowing the Sandinistas, so his administration begins to illegally sell arms to Iran in order to keep funding them. It's called the Iran-Contra scandal, and it deserves its own separate video. Regardless, the US continues to support the Contras. In the 1990 Nicaraguan election, the George H.W. Bush administration authorizes almost $50 million of non-lethal aid to the Contras. They continue to fight and assassinate candidates until their preferred party wins the election. Overall, the Nicaraguan effort is pretty down and dirty. If nothing else, it really establishes Reagan's reputation as a hardcore Cold Warrior beyond any shadow of a doubt. However, it does bring a lot of negative attention to the Reagan administration and the US at large, even if it does ultimately succeed in neutralizing the Sandinistas. Nicaragua is C tier. Grenada, 1983. You may have never even heard of Grenada, but it's a lovely island nation northeast of Venezuela. And until 1974, it was a British colony. Like many recently decolonized nations, Grenada turned to communism. In 1979, the Marxist-Leninist New Jewel movement seizes power, suspends the constitution, and rules the country for 4 years. During this time, they began constructing the Point Salinas International Airport. The Grenadans claimed the airport was meant to accommodate jets carrying tourists, but Ronnie wasn't buying it. The US suspects the airport is actually being built as a hub for Soviet weapon distribution. In fact, US Representative Ron Dellums actually goes to Grenada to get to the bottom of it. And he basically says, yeah, this is ridiculous, it's just an airport. Based on my personal observations, discussion, and analysis of the new international airport under construction in Grenada, it is my conclusion that this product is specifically now and has always been for the purpose of economic development and is not for military use. But hey, who cares? They're the bad guys. They must be up to something.
I represent America as a human rights ambassador, but before I take such a post, you have to clean your own backyard first.
If this justification sounds flimsy to you, that's because it is. It's my opinion that the US's concern was not with the airport, but rather with the people of Grenada themselves. Specifically, their language. Grenada's leader, Maurice Bishop, said it better than I ever could.
And the Grenada Revolution is in one sense even worse because the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada speaks English and therefore can communicate directly to the people of the United States. We can have a dangerous appeal to 30 million black people in the United States.
So in 1983, when there's a struggle within Grenada's ruling party, the US takes the opportunity to swoop in. The invasion takes 3 days, and it's not really a contest. I mean, Grenada's like 100 square miles of island with less than 100,000 people living on it at this point. There are dudes in Oklahoma named like Jimbo who own more land than the entire country of Grenada. Anyway, the US invades, puts our guy in charge, and then leaves. You're welcome for the freedom. The UN passes a resolution condemning it, of course, but what are those pencil pushers gonna do about it? But they just don't get it, man. There's Americans in there studying at a university in Grenada. At least that's one of the justifications the Reagan administration gave. Which, like, there's Americans in every country. That doesn't really cut it, at least in my mind. Overall, this invasion was pretty bad optically and didn't really do a whole lot. I mean, it really was probably just an airport, and even if the whole island was swarming with Antifa super soldiers, what are they gonna do? Grenada is basically just a rock with a bunch of sheep on it. It's not really a threat. And though it is true that Grenada's status as an English-speaking country would make it more formidable, their small stature and status as a developing nation means they would probably never be able to be much more than a mouthpiece. Reagan tried to use this to kind of pump up the military, you know, a little Top Gun action, like people were feeling pretty rough after Vietnam. Anyway, the invasion of Grenada did pretty much nothing, other than maybe make Reagan feel like more of a cowboy. D tier. Panama, 1989. For a good part of the 20th century, Manuel Noriega rules Panama as a US-aligned anti-communist dictator. Classic. Not only that, Noriega is also a paid CIA asset and informant. At this time, H.W. Bush is CIA director and totally has Noriega in his back pocket. Things are going great, you know? Noriega is getting paid handsomely for participating in the CIA orchestrated drug trafficking scheme, you know, that Iran-Contra thing we mentioned a minute ago. But, you know, all good things must come to an end. In '86, Noriega gets exposed for drug trafficking, and Reagan starts to pressure him to step down. Supporting the dictator is starting to become kind of a bad look. In '88, Noriega's regime survives a coup attempt. Sensing he's becoming more of a liability than an asset to the US, Noriega starts to switch sides and cozy up to the Soviet bloc. But it's too little too late. Bush, now president, denies prior knowledge of Noriega's involvement with the drug trade, despite having met with Noriega while director of the CIA, and also having been chair of the Task Force on Drugs as vice president. Yeah, okay, dude. In 1989, the US launches an invasion into Panama, including among its rationale, combating drug trafficking, considering that Panama had become a center for drug money laundering and a transit point for drug trafficking to the US and Europe. Yeah, wonder how that happened. The conflict takes a little over a month, resulting in American victory and a fat load of kills for Uncle Sam, including, by the way, a lot of civilians. About 200 according to the US military and about 500 according to the UN, which is pretty bad. We did get Noriega though, and I just wanted to share a funny bit of trivia I found about his capture on the Wikipedia page. Noriega remained at large for several days, but realizing he had few options in the face of a massive manhunt and a $1 million reward for his capture, He obtained refuge in the Vatican diplomatic mission in Panama City. The US military's psychological pressure on him and the diplomatic pressure on the Vatican mission, however, was relentless, as was the playing of loud rock and roll music day and night in a densely populated area. The report of the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff claimed that the music was used principally to prevent parabolic microphones from being used to eavesdrop on negotiations, and not as a psychological weapon based around Noriega's supposed loathing of rock music. We are the bad guys, but that's pretty funny. Would love to get a hold of that playlist. Cool soundtrack aside, the invasion went over like a white Russian at an AA meeting.
Yeah, sure, white Russian.
Hey, careful, man. There's a beverage here, huh? Start talking and talk fast, you lousy bum.
We've been frantically trying to reach you, dude.
I genuinely don't even know if this video is good or not anymore. I seriously can't tell, and I'm literally just... Article 2 of the UN Charter, pretty important international law document, prohibits the use of force by member nations to settle disputes, except in self-defense or when authorized by the United Nations Security Council. Obviously, neither of those conditions were met when the United States invaded Panama. Also, the Constitution. The stone tablets of freedom themselves say this was a no-no. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the sole power to declare war. I guess Bush never read it though, because he just kind of went for it. No congressional authorization required. Ultimately, the UN passed a resolution condemning it, activists spoke out, and then Bush went to jail. Just kidding about that last part, obviously. Nothing happened, and people mostly forgot about it, but while it was in the news, it was a bad look. And it sort of shattered the illusion that the US respects international law at all if it doesn't benefit them. At the end of the day, though, we did get Noriega. Mission accomplished. Wrong Bush. This was really more of a mop-up operation at the end of the Cold War. Messy, but maybe had to happen. Tie up loose ends. Panama is C tier. I told you at the beginning of the video I would be telling a story. This is a story about an empire and what it does to secure its dominance. It's the story that flows mostly silently underneath all the myths and grand narratives we tell ourselves about what this country is and what it represents. It's a story about the Third World War, fought just out of sight by spies and assassins. It's a story about what happens when two ways of being come into conflict. I hope that what I've told you today gets you to think about the events of the 20th century a little differently, and about socialism a little differently. I am not asking you to become a socialist. All I'm asking you to do is to reconsider the commonly held wisdom that socialism always fails. I would ask you why, if socialism is just a technically bankrupt pipe dream, so many were willing to give up their lives for it. And why the most powerful country in the world would stoop to torture, murder, and subversion to stop its spread. The story I'm telling is one of conflict, and conflict is one of the things needed to drive a narrative. Another element that most good stories have is a satisfying ending, but ours, for better or for worse, does not have any ending. In fact, our story is still being written. As US citizens, as people who live at the core of this empire, it is our duty and our responsibility to break this cycle and stop this bloodshed. Many people at the center of this empire and at its edges have given their lives to stop this imperial machine. But make no mistake, it is still running. The CIA's job description has not changed. Even now, they're waging a shadow drone war in Africa. Needless to say, I've only covered in this video the coups that we know about. Many of the documents which provided the sourcing for this video were only recently declassified. But really, if a foreign intervention truly goes to plan, nobody even knows it happened. You may have noticed that I didn't utilize the S tier that most other tier list videos use. This is partially because I think 5 tiers are plenty, but it's also because, by definition, any of the operations that I've covered, any of the operations that we know about, are less than perfect. All the plots that will be lost to history, all the schemes that will die with those that executed them, those are S tier. Thanks for watching. Stick around if you want some further reading and resources, but first, you know what I'm about to say. You're not going to escape in a video this high effort without a self-promo. If you thought this video was valuable, then sign up to my Patreon. I seriously love making these videos. There's nothing in the world that I enjoy more, but I have limited time. The more that people like you contribute, the more time I can spend on making content that I really enjoy, and that hopefully you enjoy too. I promise I would have some further resources, so if you want to learn more, I would totally recommend reading the Jakarta method. Pretty much covers what I did in this video, except, you know, by somebody who's an author and actually did research beyond reading Wikipedia articles. Second thing, this is gonna sound kind of weird, but if an incident struck your fancy, you know, if you want to learn more about a particular topic, just go to that Wikipedia page and then scroll down to the citations and then just research books from that list because they're going to be relevant to that topic, you know, or read through the article, find a footnote, and then find that book. That's it for me. Goodbye.